Hello, it's Sunday, the 4th of February. We continue reading the Masters. Today we're going to be delving into Chapter 1 and the introduction of John Brown by Wwe B Dubois. The introduction was written by John Roediger. And here we go. In 1938, W.E.B. Du Bois remembered the years during which he wrote John Brown as a deep period of deep personal transformation. He specifically recalled 1906 when his growing political activism had led him to Harper's Ferry, the scene of John Brown's raid. Members of the Niagara Movement, a recently formed African-American group planning civil rights protests, had gathered there. According to Du Bois, they made the pilgrimage at dawn barefooted to the scene of Brown's martyrdom and talked some of the plainest English that had ever been given voice by black men in America. Du Bois stood as the day dawned in Harper's Ferry as both a militant pilgrim and as Brown's academic biographer. This two-ness summed up a broader change in tension in his life, a Harvard-trained historian and sociologist by then in his late 30s. Du Bois was torn between what might now be called advocacy and scholarship. Du Bois's own terminology had a different ring. After that Harper's Ferry pilgrimage, the fat was in the fire, and my career as a scientist was beginning to be swallowed up in my role as a protagonist. And this was not at all to my liking. At the Niagara movement, as the Niagara movement waned and then practically became merged with the new interracial agitation that coalesced as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Du Bois continued to be swept up in his current to a new and different mode of expression. Just as instantly as he later put it, I continued to cling to my scientific work. That a book of the stature of John Brown came out of this maelstrom suggests that, at the least in the case of Du Bois, the tension between the activist and the academic impulse can be a creative one. Indeed, rehearsing the uncanny ways in which publishing history of John Brown was interwoven with its author's political, personal, and professional transformation gives us access to the ways in which circumstance and movement inform genius and vice versa. The request that Du Bois contribute a volume to the American Crisis biography series came in a November 1903 letter from the historian Ellis Paxson Obenhostler, who edited the series for George W. Jacobs and Company. Obenhostler outlined the project's plans for 25 biographies of Civil War era figures. From the start, he invoked objectivity and viewpoint in curious juxtaposition. Motivating the series was a desire to let writers born after the war look calmly and dispassionately at the issue and see both sides without the prejudices of wartime. But this objectivity was to be strangely assured. The 10 projected volumes on white Southerners, 2 on African Americans, was foreseen would be written by white Southern writers as a guarantee of greater impartiality. In commissioning a work from Du Bois, an African American scholar's perspective, your view was clearly being sought for good measure. Obenhauser credentialed himself as descended from the principal Pennsylvania station keeper of the Underground Railroad, which had hidden and transported fugitive slaves. Obenhauser, a University of Pennsylvania PhD, praised the Atlanta University-based Du Bois for his good work in the historical field from the time when you were in Philadelphia. The meticulous research of Du Bois had appeared in print in The Suppression of the African American Slave Trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, and The Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, as well as a host of specialized sociological studies, but it was surely the much more lyrical, opinionated, and politically combative the souls of black folks that brought Du Bois to public knowledge. At the time, Obenhauser wrote that Du Bois' Souls had scarcely been out 6 months, but was already selling briskly in a second edition. It enjoyed wildly mixed reviews, which identified Du Bois as the leading critic of the powerful, accommodative black leader, Booker T. Washington. In proposing a biography focusing on Frederick Douglass but encompassing material on the fugitive slave law, slave trading, and the Underground Railroad, Obenhauser proved unlucky. Du Bois was almost immediately ascended, and within 3 weeks plans for a Du Bois biography of Douglass seemed finalized. But in early December, Booker T. Washington himself surprisingly returned a much earlier letter from Obenhauser and claimed Douglass as his topic. In January 1904, the editor would shamefacedly write Du Bois that the offer to portray Douglass had to be withdrawn, given that the publisher was very desirous of adding Mr. Washington's name to the series. Obenhauser suggested that Du Bois write the life of Reconstruction era Senator Blanche K. Bruce or another figure whom Du Bois might propose. With no hesitation and without lingering over what Obenhauser himself called the great discourtesy of the withdrawal of the author to write on Frederick Douglass, Du Bois proposed to write the Virginia slave rebel Nat Turner's biography, questioning both the availability of sources and Turner's importance. The editor balked. Du Bois emphasized that great stories swirled around Turner and asked that Obenhauser confer with the eminent historian John Bach McMasters on Turner's suitability. However, after that consultation, Obenhauser, though fearing Du Bois would think him very hard to suit, refused approval of the Turner biography. His counter-proposal was for a life of John Brown, a subject on which Du Bois' views would entertain me very much, and I'm certain many others too. Du Bois' 1904 acceptance of the contract to portray Brown, the greatest white ally of black freedom movements, came during a period in which W. B. Du Bois' own ascendancy as an activist brought him to contact with friendly whites of astonishing and credulous varieties. At times, he showed remarkable patience, as in pursuing the contract with Obenhauser after being passed over in favor of his rival on the Douglass biography and vetoed on the Turner one. At other junctures, his criticism of whites who professed liberalism but practiced paternalism were withering. His 1908 attack on the celebrated historian Charles Francis Adams, whose pamphlet The Solid South examined the Afro-American race problem, even as Adams did not for a moment profess to be informed on the subject, showed both what Du Bois was up against and how he stood up to it. Adams, the grandson and great-grandson of presidents, was excoriated for a work that was not only ill-considered and wrong, but distinctly sensational in the worst sense of the term. As Du Bois began John Brown, he suffered through protracted exchanges of letters illustrating just how complex dealings with white allies could be. In January 1905, an article he had charged that Booker T. Washington recently spent $3,000 bribing the African-American press. This charge, based on widespread assumptions and protected sources, was not well documented, and Oswald Garrison Villiard, owner of the New York Evening Post and The Nation, demanded firm proof. The situation featured shifting cross currents. Villiard was the great, exceptionally wealthy and influential grandson of the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. In 1905, he supported Washington, but not uncritically. He had given Souls of Black Folks kind reviews in both of his publications. In the unsigned Evening Post review, the author, probably Villiers himself, explicitly voiced doubts about Washington's public philosophy of apolitical uplift and industrial education. Villiers had, moreover, attempted to direct philanthropy to Atlanta University, beleaguered for its rejection of industrial education and for its embrace of Du Bois on the other hand. Villiers' tone was impervious. He did not request documentation of the charges. Du Bois's biographer, David Leving Lewis, writes, but commanded it. Du Bois' feuds and cooperation with Villiers would persist for 40 years, complicated by the latter's acquiescence to his Georgia-born wife's refusal to admit black guests into their home. In 1905, Wwe B Dubois and Villiers exchanged no fewer than 8 letters concerning the press bribery charge over the period of 10 weeks. Du Bois crafted responses with care, withdrawing taut drafts and building a strong circumstantial case for the charges. Villiers remained unconvinced and singularly unimpressed by Du Bois's use of information from the African-American activist William Monroe Trotter, soon to be a stalwart in the Niagara movement. Villiers dismissively responded that Trotter, who was under me at Harvard, was a very dangerous, almost irresponsible young man whose behavior made it impossible for anyone to consider seriously his opinions on any subject relating to his race. Trotter, meanwhile, expressed a generalized distrust of alliances with whites. Du Bois, even as he continued to work with Trotter, took great care not to alienate Villiers in 1905 and even hoped to educate him. In the trying situation in which we Negroes find ourselves today, we especially need the aid and countenance of men like you. This may look to outsiders as a petty squabble of thoughtless self-seekers. It is, in fact, the life and death struggle of 9 million men. As he steered between the logic of separatism and the struggles of white liberals, W. Du Bois studied John Brown. By November 1907, news of yet another deep honoree connected his academic and activist projects that reached Du Bois. Oswald Garrison Villiers was also at work on a biography of John Brown. Not surprisingly, given his own travails, Du Bois's John Brown concentrates on what made Brown an ideal ally in the black freedom struggle. In mounting this portrayal, Du Bois contributed his part to a river of African-American adulation of Brown, whose 1859 raid on the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and martyrdom established his willingness to fight and to die, even as it failed to liberate the slaves. This willingness to confront slavery violently certainly accounts for some of the African-American admiration for John Brown. Such admiration began with blacks who worked with Brown in the League of the Gileadites, the 5 African-Americans who helped besiege Harper's Ferry, and the African-American abolitionist John Rock, who declared, "I believe in insurrections," just after the raid. It reached to Malcolm X and to James Baldwin, who, when asked what lackluster presidential candidate he would be voting for, once declared John Brown. Brown's revolutionary commitment and Christian martyrdom were also much invoked by those who kept his flame alive. Such virtues also matter in Du Bois's account of Brown as an Old Testament militant consecrated by religious anger and innocent death. But in the end, Du Bois is equivocal concerning revolutionary violence and far more impressed by Brown's life than his death. The heroism Du Bois captures comes from Brown's participating in a specifically African-American abolitionism. If Du Bois does not quite go so far as Frederick Douglass, who found Brown in sympathy a black man, he does surely regard Brown's greatness in the light of the latter's clear perception that black actions against slavery were the leading edge of antebellum freedom movements. As early as 1903, Du Bois had written that the assertion of manhood rights of the Negro by himself was the main reliance of the antebellum years, and that John Brown's raid was the extreme of its logic. John Brown fully elaborates this theme in his magnificent chapter opener. Du Bois perfectly sets the context of Brown's birth and of Brown's greatness. Just at the close of the 18th century, first in Philadelphia and then in New York, small groups of free blacks withdrew from white churches and established churches of their own, which still have millions of adherents. In the year of John Brown's birth, 1800, Gabriel planned his formidable uprising in Virginia. Herbert Aithiker, following Du Bois, has pronounced 1800 as probably the most fateful year in the history of the American Negro slave revolts, emphasizing that it saw the birth of Turner as well as of Brown, in that Denmark Vesey, the third great strategist of revolt, brought his freedom at the time with lottery winnings. Indeed, it was precisely the first moment of 1800 when Vesey drew his first free breath. 22 years later, Du Bois wrote Vesey would go grimly to the scaffold after one of the shrewdest Negro plots ever to frighten the South into hysterics. Connecting Brown with his 1800 birth rather than with his 1859 death, Du Bois linked his magnificence with that of Nat Turner, Gabriel, Vesey, and the post-Haiti Black Revolt, and resistance generally. He insisted on this point, acknowledging that in his early life, John Brown's consciousness was but slightly touched by revolts, but added that in the later years he learned of Gabriel, Vesey, and Turner, and told of their exploits and studied their plans. Speaking more generally of Brown's contacts with African Americans, Du Bois wrote, he sought them in homes and church and out on the street, and he hired them in his business. He came to them on a plane of perfect equality. They sat at his table and he at theirs. What John Redpath had called Brown's higher notion of the capacity of the Negro race, his faith in their fitness to take care of themselves, was to Du Bois the key to Brown's genius. The modern work that comes closest to approximating Du Bois' sense of how militancy and racial egalitarianism were linked for Brown is surely Russell Banks' wise and dramatic historical novel Cloud Splitter. This book roots pivotal early chapters in the Brown family's direct action of resistance to slavery and to the capture of runaway slaves. The Underground Railroad adventures of the Brown's Bank stresses consistently express John Brown's preference for working with African Americans rather than with white abolitionists. In this work, it's their lives that are on the line, Brown reasoned. When it comes to a showdown, white people can always go home and read their Bibles if they want. Who would you rather have at your side, a well-meaning white fella who can cut and run if he wants, or a Negro man whose freedom is on the line? By virtue of his continued work with black freedom fighters, John Brown occupied a privileged position from which to see the possibilities of resistance. As Du Bois had it, nowhere did the imminence of a great struggle show itself more clearly than among Negroes themselves. Organized insurrection ceased in the South, not because of the increased vigors of the slave system, but because the greater safety valve of escape northward was opened wider and wider. The slaves and the freemen started to work and to the end bore the brunt of danger and hardship, but gradually they more and more secured the cooperation of men like John Brown. The narrator of Cloud Splitter, Brown's son Owen, adds that the knowledge of the existing patterns of flight to freedom and of the ongoing defense of such flight gave John Brown plans for insurrection their shape, inspiration, and grounding. Du Bois showed, moreover, that Brown's commitment to struggling alongside black people did not, given reality of day-to-day contact under tremendous pressure, could not partake of a sentimentalism that would make him blind to their imperfections. Though surely awed by the heroism of Harriet Tubman and deeply impressed by Frederick Douglass, John Brown did not romanticize African Americans collectively or individually. John Brown hated slavery and race prejudice precisely because they exacted terrible human costs, especially in the realm of education. According to Dubois, John Brown knew African Americans as having human weaknesses, but sustained faith in their ability to rise above these faults. The most direct expression of both Brown's critical edge and his faith in the ability of African Americans to liberate themselves was his remarkable 1948 essay, Sambo's Mistakes. In it, Brown wrote in the voice of an African American, though not in dialect, reflecting on the lessons he had painfully learned. Partly a self-help manual and partly a revolutionary track in blackface. Sambo's Mistakes encourages readers to study more, talk less, save, invest, disdain mainstream politicians, abstain from tobacco, and above all, unite and resist. Du Bois found the essay quaint, and certainly modern readers will see it as that, if not preachy and insufferable. But Du Bois added that he also thought it was excellent, delicately worded, and well worth rereading 60 years after its appearance. Such an assessment registers how thoroughly Brown managed to become a comrade in arms rather than a cheerleader or a dictator when black resistance was concerned. As Du Bois realizes, to see him as a singular genius who rose and fell and perhaps Christ-like rose again in 1859 slights the connection with ongoing black militancy which enabled him to dream of and lead a rebel force and to demand that when publicly murdered for hanging for his resistance, his only religious attendants would be poor little dirty, ragged, bare-headed slave boys and girls led by some gray-headed slave mother. The other vital point that Du Bois preserved by dating John Brown's greatness from his birth rather than from his death concerns the remarkable internationalism of his campaigns and of the history of slave revolts generally. If 1800 was the most fateful year in such struggles, the Pan-African resonance of the year certainly are one key to its centrality. Du Bois observed there was hell in Haiti in the red waning of the 18th century in the days when John Brown was born. 10,000 Frenchmen gasped and died in the fevered hills there, while the black men in a sudden frenzy fought like devils for their freedom and won it. The Haitian Revolution begins Du Bois's account of what and how John Brown developed a vision of the damned, not because its spirit was in the air at its birth, but because it so lastingly informed and emboldened rebels in the United States. What Du Bois called the shudder of Haiti was context for Gable's rebellion, along with the echoes of the French Revolution. Vesey devoured written accounts of the events in Haiti where he had lived for a time. His 1822 plot would promise that aid from Haiti could decisively help the rebels. Du Bois began John Brown's with a section titled Africa and America, the turn of the century church building that he saw as so pivotal in the development of a freedom movement featured churches that often took on the name African. From the Stono and New York City revolts of the 18th century on, African-born slaves and African traditions played signal roles in rebellions. No leader more brilliantly marshaled African participation than Vesey. When Brown stayed in North Aba, New York, his revolutionary activity was in concert with members of the black farming community that drew him there. The village had taken the name of Timbuktu, same as Timbuktu in Guinea, as a character in Cloud Splitter put it. Like Vesey's plot, Brown promised despoiling aid, coming in this case from black communities in Canada. Finally, Du Bois strikingly argued against the view that Brown's martyrdom further emancipation only or mainly insofar as it inspired intellectuals and polarized political parties. Frederick Douglass's tribute, if Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery, led Du Bois into a deep inquiry regarding cause and effect. The path by which John Brown's raid precipitated the Civil War, he concluded, included the arousal of Northern conscience and the lending of political ammunition to Southern secessionist political leaders. But Du Bois was clear as to Brown's central contribution. In the first place, he aroused the Negroes in Virginia, and thus helped set into motion what Du Bois would later call the general strike of slaves who fled to and fought for freedom. Although John Brown's plan failed at the time, Du Bois wrote a century after John Brown's death, it was actually arms and tools in the hands of 500,000 Negroes that won the Civil War. John Brown, delayed by commitments to journalistic writing, frequent lectures, political agitation, family illnesses, the Atlanta race riots of 1906, and Du Bois's attempts to alternate between working on it and his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, which was published in 1911, did not appear until 1909, one of the longest-term book projects in Du Bois's career. It nonetheless had to be rushed into 1909 publication to coincide with the 50th anniversary of John Brown's execution. The reception of the book was disappointing. Historical writing on whites by black historians provoked puzzlement and disinterest more readily than respectful attention, as the great historian John Hope Franklin remarked, based on a bitter experience even as late as the 1950s. The anniversary of Brown's death and the lively prose of the book excited very few reviews, especially in the mainstream press. The poorly marketed volume, the only full-length biography ever written by Du Bois, and his favorite of his many books, sold fewer than 700 copies. The Independent, a leading reform weekly, did praise John Brown in two separate notices, liking especially its force and its viewpoint, that of a champion of the race. In the American Historical Review, North Carolina-born Wwe E Dodd of the University of Chicago offered a brief mixed review. Dodd, Jefferson Davis's biographer in the same American Crisis series, complained that hero worship, perhaps sensationalism, are the terms which most aptly describe the style of this new life. Still, Dodd found much that commends the book, especially in its author's qualification and in its pacing. Villiard's own massive biography of Brown, appearing months after Du Bois and from a well-connected author and from a much larger publishing house, enjoyed better and wider reviews. Villiard's interpretation found Brown's heroism to lie in his death far more than in his life, and thus distancing Brown from black history. Villiard told a story much more congenial to white readers. For good measure, he also wrote an extremely damaging, unsigned review of Du Bois's Brown and published it just before the appearance of his own Brown book. Indeed, it appeared twice in both the Evening Post and in The Nation. This use of anonymity and family business to discredit a rival's book infuriated Du Bois, as did the tone and content of the review. Though praising Du Bois as gifted and John Brown as a readable volume, Villiard's review was almost relentlessly negative. He indicted Du Bois for failing to do substantial new research beyond the published primary sources and extant biographies of Brown, missing the rationale of the interpretive volume and of the series. Villiard noted neither Du Bois's viewpoint nor his command of the history of African American resistance to slavery. Villiard, as in his own biography of Brown and in his bizarre 1930 insistence that the crisis achieved balance by publishing lists of crimes committed by blacks, made a great deal of objectivity in the review of Du Bois. He bemoaned the absence of brown scholars who had written in the spirit or matter of the historian who desires to be impartial or to go to the original sources for information. Sticking with the science versus propaganda distinction that so worried Du Bois, Villiers then dismissed even the original sources used by Du Bois, including Franklin Sanborn's biography with documents and Osborne P. Anderson's account of the raid at Harper's Ferry, as unreliable because they were partisan. Avoiding engagement on questions of analysis, Villiers corrected Du Bois on a long series of quibbling points, some of which remain objects of dispute. Du Bois immediately wrote a letter to the nation, contesting most of the quibbles, often by quoting careful language in which he framed the points at issue in John Brown. In a protracted exchange of letters with the nation's editor, Paul Elmer Murray, Du Bois learned that the rejoinder to the review would not be published. He was also treated to a remarkable remedial lesson on the duty of a historian with regard to primary sources. Finally, Villiers himself wrote to Du Bois professing to be wounded by the amazing charge which Du Bois had made in the subsequent correspondence with Murray, not in a reply that he wished to have published, that the review unfairly treated a rival book of mine. Villiers added that the whole character and standing of the Evening Post and the Nation belied such a charge, before lecturing Du Bois on historical methods. A few months later, Du Bois was moved from Atlanta to New York City to direct propaganda for the coalescing NAACP. His new office was at 20 Vesey Street, an editorial desk in the Evening Post building that Villiers owned. John Brown did not initially find its audience. Du Bois found few John Browns among white allies and of necessity worked with Oswald Garrison Villiers instead, amidst chronically poor funding at Atlanta University, and given the opposition of Villiers and others to his desire to have research as part of his NAACP portfolio, Du Bois' science suffered under the serious handicaps. Indeed, as David Levering Lewis observed regarding this period in W.E.B. Du Bois' career, without money, both scholarship and advocacy faltered. But John Brown fits differently and far more optimistically into the longer story of Du Bois' work. Its republication in 1962 excited considerable interest in the African American press and contributed to a wave of scholarship, placing African Americans at the center of their own history and of the nation's. As he finished John Brown, building both on the themes in it and the life experiences informing it, Du Bois turned to new directions that would occupy much of the rest of his life. Reflecting a growing interest in socialism and in the sobering probing the possibility of finding broader numbers of white allies, he revised his economic novel, The Quest of Silver Fleece, for a 1911 publication. His 1910 essay, The Souls of White Folks, originally in The Independent, took on both white supremacy and paternalism. It continued inquiries into the meanings and miseries of white identity begun in John Brown, where he had argued that deterioration from within threatened the white race. Most important, Du Bois delivered in 1909 and published in 1910 his article-length challenge to the American Historical Association to rethink Reconstruction in light of what the free people did rather than how they were used. While his earlier writings had pre-gauged Du Bois' interest in land and politics after the Civil War, Reconstruction and its benefits clearly joined John Brown in seeing African Americans as principal actors in emancipation and in its aftermath. Fascinatingly, Du Bois republished John Brown in 1962 in honor of no Brown anniversary, but of the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation. When Du Bois would visit emancipation and its aftermath in 1935 and his magnificent Black Reconstruction, he would do so precisely in the political context of a desire to intervene in the debates about alliances with whites, the limits of labor unity, the need for continued emphasis of the independent African American organizations. But this time, he would not allow the advocacy that made his work propaganda. He titled the bracing closing chapter of Black Reconstruction, the propaganda of history, fixing that label on the historians who acted as apologists for the restoration of white supremacy, and bringing his own combination of science, truth, and even poetry to bear against such apologists. W. E B Du Bois surely built upon the insistence developed in John Brown that African Americans be placed at the center of struggles for their own freedom. In the preface, after the work of Sanborn, Hinton, Connolly, and Redpath, the only excuse for another life of John Brown is an opportunity to lay new emphasis upon the material which they have so carefully collected and to treat these facts from a different point of view. The viewpoint adopted in this book is that of the little known but vastly important inner development of the Negro American. John Brown worked not simply for black men, he worked with them. He was a companion of their daily life, knew their faults and virtues, and felt as few white Americans had felt the bitter tragedy of their lot. The story of John Brown then cannot be complete unless due emphasis is given this phase of his activity. Unfortunately, however, few written records of these friendships and this long continued intimacy exist, so that little new material along these lines can be adduced. For most, part one must be content with quoting the authors mentioned, and I have quoted them freely, and other writers like Anderson, Featherstone, Barry, Hunter, Boatletter, Douglass, and Hamilton. But even in the absence of special material, the great broad truths are clear, and this book is at once a record of and a tribute to the man who all Americans have perhaps come nearest to touching the real souls of black folks, W. E B Du Bois. In Chapter 1, Africa and America, that might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I've called my son. The mystic spell of Africa is and ever was over all America. It guided her hardest works, inspired her finest literature, and sung her sweetest songs. Her greatest destiny, unsensed and despised though it be, is to give back to the first continents the gifts which Africa of old gave to America's fathers. Of all inspiration which America owes to Africa, however, the greatest by far is the score of heroic men whom sorrows of these dark children called to unselfish devotion and heroic self-realization. Benanzi, Garrison, Harriet Stowe, Sumner, Douglass, Lincoln, these and others, but above all, John Brown. John Brown was a Stuart rough-hewed man, mightily yet tenderly carved. To his making went the stern justice of a Cromwellian ensign, the freedom-loving fire of a Welsh Celt, and the thrift of a Dutch housewife. In these things it was, thrift, freedom, and justice, that early crossed the unknown seas to find asylum in America, yet they came late, for before them came greed, and greed brought black slaves from Africa. The Negroes came on the heels, if not on the very ships of Columbus. They followed De Soto to the Mississippi, saw Virginia with D'Aillon, Mexico with Cortez, Peru with Pizarro, and led the western wanderings of Coronado in his search for the seven cities of Cibola. Something more than a decade after the Cavaliers and a year before the Pilgrims, they set lasting foot on the North American continent. These black men came not of their own willing, but because the hasty greed of New America selfishly and thoughtlessly sought to revive in the new world the dying but unforgotten custom of enslaving the world's workers. So with the birth of wealth and liberty west of the seas came slavery, and a slavery all the more cruel and hideous because it gradually built itself on a caste of race and color, thus breaking the common bonds of human fellowship and weaving artificial barriers of birth and appearance. The result was evil, as all injustice must be. At first the black men robbed and struggled and died in their bonds, and their blood reddened the paths across the Atlantic and around the beautiful isles of the Western Indies. Then as the bonds gripped them closer and closer, they succumbed to the sullen indifference or happy ignorance, with only here and there flashes of wild red vengeance. For after all, these black men were but men, neither more nor less wonderful than other men. In build and stature they were made for the most part among the taller nations and sturdily made. In their mental equipment and their moral prose they showed themselves full brothers to all men, intensely human, and this too in their very modifications and peculiarities. Their warm brown and bronze color and crisp curled hair under the heat and wet of Africa, their sensuous enjoyment of the music and color of life, their instinct for barter and trade, their strong family life and government. Yet these characteristics were bruised and soiled and misinterpreted in the rude uprooting of the slave trade and of the sudden transportation of this race to other climes, among other peoples. Their color became a badge of servitude. Their tropical habit was deemed laziness. Their worship was thought heathenish. Their family customs and government were ruthlessly overturned and debauched. Many of their virtues became vices, and much of their vice, virtue. The price of repression is greater than the cost of liberty. The degradation of men costs something both to degraded and those who degrade, while the Negro slaves sank to the listless docility of vacant ignorance. Their masters found themselves whirled in the eddies of mighty movements. Their system of slavery was twisting them backwards towards darker ages of force and caste and cruelty, while forward swirled swift currents of liberty and uplift. They still felt the impulse of the wonderful awakening of culture from its barbaric sleep of centuries, which men call the Renaissance. They were own children of the mighty stern of Europe's conscience, which we call the Reformation, and they and their children were to be prime actors in laying the foundations of human liberty in a new century and in a new land. Already the birth plans of the new freedom were felt in that land. Old Europe was begetting in the new continent a vast longing for spiritual space. So there was builded into America the thrift of the searches of wealth, the freedom of the Renaissance, and the stern morality of the Reformation. Three lands typified these three things which time planted in the New World. England sent Puritanism, the last white flower of the Lutheran revolt. Holland sent the new vigors and thrift of the Renaissance, while Celtic lands and bits of land like France and Ireland and Wales sent the passionate desire for personal freedom. These three elements came more often than not in the guise of humble men, an English carpenter on the Mayflower, an Amsterdam tailor seeking a new ancestral city, and a Welsh wanderer. From three such men sprang in the marriage of years, John Brown. To the unraveling of human tangles, we would gladly believe that God sent special men, chosen vessels, which come to the world's deliverance. And what could be more fitting than that the human embodiments of freedom, Puritanism, and trade, the great current sweeping across the back eddies of slavery, should give birth to a man who in years to come pointed the way to liberty and realized that the cost of liberty was less than the price of oppression. So it was. And bleak December 1620, a carpenter and weaver landed at Plymouth, Peter and John Brown. This carpenter Peter came of goodly stock, possibly, though not surely, from that very John Brown of the early 16th century who bluffed King Henry VIII of England, burned for his Puritanism, and whose son was all too near the same fate. 30 years after Peter Brown had landed came Welshman John Owen to Windsor, Connecticut to help in the building of that commonwealth, and near him settled Peter Mills, the tailor of Holland, the great-grandson of Peter Brown, born in Connecticut in 1700, had for his son a Revolutionary soldier who married one of the Welshman's grandchildren and had in turn a son, Owen Brown, the father of John Brown, in February 1777. This Owen Brown, a neighbor, remembers very distinctly that he was very much respected and esteemed by my father. He was an earnestly devout and religious man of the old Connecticut fashion, and indelibly, and one peculiarity of his impressed his name and person indelibly upon my memory. He was an inveterate and most painful stammerer, the first specimen of that infirmity that I'd ever seen, and according to my recollection, the worst that I'd ever known to this day. Consequently, though we removed from Hudson to another settlement early in the summer of 1807, and returned to Connecticut in 1812, so that I rarely saw any of that family afterwards, I have never to this day seen a man struggling and half strangled with a word stuck to his throat without remembering good Mr. Owen Brown, who could not speak without stammering, except in prayer. In 1800, May 9th, wrote this Owen Brown. John was born 100 years after his great-grandfather. Nothing else very uncommon. And just a little bit of chapter 2, just one page. The making of a man. There was a man called God, and his name was John. A big tall boy of 12 or 15, barefoot and bareheaded, with buckstrap breeches suspended often with one leather strap over his shoulder, roamed in the forests of northern Ohio. He remembered the days of his coming to this strange wild land, the lowing oxen, the great white wagon that wandered from Connecticut to Pennsylvania and over the swelling hills and mountains where the wild-eyed urchin of 5 sat staring at the new world of wild beasts and wilder brown men. Then came life itself in its realness, the driving of cows and the killing of rattlesnakes and swift free rides on great mornings alone with earth and tree and sky. He became a rambler in the wild new country, finding finding birds and squirrels, and sometimes a wild turkey's nest. At first the Indians filled him with strange fear, but his kindly old father thought of Indians as neither vermin nor property, and this fear soon wore off, and he used to hang about them quite as much as was consistent with good manners. And that's the end of day 4. This is Wwe B Dubois, excerpt from John Brown.